Hi, I'm Linda. I spent lockdown with my partner, Chris,
Hello.
and our son, who was 8 at the start of COVID, I think.
Yes, that's right.
And it was, I'd say, throughout the whole period, there were some really, really difficult times and some really fun times as well. So it was quite a mixed bag, really.
Yeah, I remember a lot of anxiety about what would happen. I ran my own business. I still run my own business, but I changed things. I started doing more teaching with the OU because it was available, and whilst it doesn't pay very well, it was something I knew that would happen, and so and a lot of that changed. A lot of my face to face stuff disappeared. Some people were happy to do stuff online. Other people weren't. I lost about 60% of my revenue from the business in quite a short space of time, which was a bit frightening, to be honest. But at the same time, I played hundreds of overs of bin cricket with Herbie in the garden. I built a treehouse platform, which was a lot of fun. It was kind of, it was strange having the combination of anxiety and freedom at the same time. That was a weird thing.
Yeah, that very first bit was really difficult because we initially thought it was for a relatively short amount of time. So we thought we were looking at like 6 weeks, 2 months,
Yeah.
that kind of period. I was working full time. I was already a home worker, which was kind of weird because the whole world thought, you're already a home worker, that's fine. You just crack on as usual, including my employer to some extent. But of course, suddenly we were homeschooling as well. So we were doing that horrible split shift working, essentially, because I was working first thing in the morning, like from 6 o'clock in the morning, and then taking over, doing a bit of homeschooling for a big block, and then going back to work, and you were doing the opposite shift pattern. So that first bit, we were just working incredibly hard, completely running on adrenaline, really. And then I don't know, it was about 3 weeks, a month into that, it was just like, this is completely unsustainable. And it just felt like a bit of a crash and it was really difficult. And then my employer was kind of really good because they said, oh, you don't need to work full-time hours if you've got caring responsibilities. But our workload had gone up. So I didn't have to be present at work, but I had all this work to do as well as homeschooling, and I was trying to do it all. And then I'd say about 6 weeks in, I realised that it was going to be much longer, and I just started dumping work like nobody's business. If I didn't see it as critical, I was like, it's just not getting done. I've just got to dump that, not worry about long-term career aspirations, just dump everything that we could survive without.
It was difficult because there was anxiety about what would happen, but at the same time, you were looking around and realising how incredibly fortunate we were. We've got a nice house and a garden, a decent sized garden, and so the restriction on our liberty was much lower than it was for lots of other people. Kind of feel bad about that, but at the same time, if you're somebody who runs your own business and there's no grant support at all for me, and other people are just getting paid to sit at home, it kind of feels weird. And we had the double whammy, trying to homeschool somebody. So, in some respects, we're incredibly fortunate. In other respects, it kind of felt, well, this is a bit unfair. And it was hard managing that.
Yeah, it was hard. I think it got a lot better once I got my head into realising I was either at work or doing childcare stroke homeschooling.
Yeah.
And so I stopped trying to do both things at once, and I went to, I'm doing one or I'm doing the other, and I'm 100% present in one or the other. And then some of that homeschooling, it was hard, but some of it was great fun as well. And like the daily exercise, Herbie and I were going out running every day, and we ran miles and miles, and that was fabulous. And being near the beach was lovely. Very aware that we're really lucky that we had access to the beach and we could go swimming and we could go running, and that was just fabulous. I was very conscious. I've got some friends who live in cities, in small flats with small children. Every so often I would think, oh my God, it must be horrendous to be cooped up in a small space without access to the countryside. Yeah, really feeling like we were very lucky, even though it was still a difficult time.
Yeah, I mean, as it wore on, it was interesting. I went to get my eldest son from university. That was a bizarre experience because we were still in the middle of, normally if I went up to see him and, when they're moving him in and out, we'd go to the pub and have a beer and a meal and stuff. We couldn't do any of that because they weren't open. We got a takeaway through a hatch and ate it in his emptied house and then drove home from York the following day. And that was weird because then he moved back here. The job that he was scheduled to start didn't start for another 6 months. For somebody so for him, his world had completely been turned on its head. Somebody who's 22, has just graduated and should be, having a high old time in the summer after university, had a pretty miserable time of it, and that was hard as well because, he was making that adjustment while he was living with us, and we hadn't been used to that.
He turned up thinking he'd come to stay for 6 weeks, and he stayed for 18 months because there was just no way of moving out. His job was home working because they couldn't open the office. And that was really, really difficult for him because he didn't know anyone here except for us.
Yeah.
So I was quite worried about him at various points about not being able to socialise because there just was no one here and no way of meeting anyone his own age.
That was pretty tough for him, and I think that kind of underlined the whole thing. It was sort of, for most middle-aged people compared to generation below them, it was a whole lot easier. Whereas if you're in your early 20s. They were robbed of a period which they would normally have. I remember what it was like when, the summer after I finished university waiting to start my job, you rarely get the opportunity to be that feckless, to be honest. But and he missed out on that, and that's kind of a bit of a shame.
Yeah, but he also had some lovely times with his younger brother.
That's true.
And it was a godsend for us because he did a lot of childcare as well, and that did make things much easier, having an extra adult in the house who could do childcare and help him with the school run. So we were quite lucky because Herbie went back to school quite early compared with the other children because I'm a key worker, so he was invited back to school. And he quite enjoyed having the small class sizes.
Yeah.
It's a real privilege to have an education from a teacher who's got a class of 6 or 7.
Yeah.
That was amazing. So in terms of schooling, he was one of the ones that actually, I think, benefited from a very much more personalised education, whereas some of the other children really missed out on key bits of education, and that's going to have a long-term impact on them.
Yeah, and I think as lockdown unravelled and you got into the later phases of it, well, for me personally anyway, I started to get angry about externalities, whereas previously it was all about what's happening to me, how am I going to cope, how's the family going to manage, how are we going to make sure we're all right. And that gradually wore into hang on a minute, what's happening here and who's running the show and how is it going? And, the whole debacle around kids going back to school for a day and then the school shutting again. And that was just like, personally, we'd made plans built around him going back to school. But on the other hand, we kind of, anybody who was looking at any of the data could tell you that wasn't going to happen. And that was infuriating. And that was, in a way, that was harder to deal with because you weren't in control of that.
Yeah.
Whereas you're dealing with your own stuff. And I found the period in the sort of later summer and early autumn quite easy because it was like, okay, I know what I've got to do now. I know I'm going to fix this situation for me and my family in the short term, and that was all right. And then it just felt like the whole thing, from a central government perspective, was falling to pieces. And that suddenly became, okay, well, these idiots are stuffing it up, But now, that's going to have an impact on everybody, including me. And it's like, and that shouldn't be happening. And I found that quite hard because there's kind of nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, and it was very frustrating where you were like looking at the data going, well, it's obvious what should happen, and then the government wouldn't back it. Like, the out to help out, it was just like, that was just mad. And the Christmas thing as well, where it's like, oh no, you've got to be able to see your families for Christmas. And you're like, well, no, that's just ridiculous. And, we went through a phase where, I was thinking I would never see my grandma again.
Yeah.
Because she was 100 just recently. So even in normal circumstances, if you haven't seen her for 6 months, you think, well, she's a very elderly woman and one day it will happen. But yeah, to go for 2 years without seeing her when she's such an old lady was really, really difficult. But equally, I didn't want to rush back to her, because I also felt she was very vulnerable as well. So there's a real tension between desperately wanting to go there, but also wanting to be really cautious. And, was it the right thing to travel on a train that was really crowded to go and visit an elderly, vulnerable woman? I think, that was quite difficult.
Yeah, although I was talking to a friend recently about this, and one of the things about Christmas being changed for a couple of years is that people are released from the kind of duty journeys they used to make, and that endless cycle of, every other year we have to go here or there. And I kind of felt it was important for us to grasp the opportunity of doing what we wanted to do rather than what we felt we should do. And to an extent we've done that, which I think has been good. And I know for other people that's been quite freeing. Some of the long-term impacts are actually beneficial, but you have to look hard for them sometimes.
Yeah, I think, I've got some colleagues who weren't allowed to homework beforehand, and they had the opportunity to prove that they can homework and they can be trusted to do it, and now they prefer to homework. Although equally, we've got a problem where we're now so homeworking that we never see colleagues. So pre-pandemic, my homeworking involved seeing colleagues probably once a fortnight, whereas post-pandemic, I see them about every 6 months, and so it's gone to homeworking for me. I'm struggling with that.
Yeah, I mean, in my business where I would previously have gone to see people all the time, there's much more flexibility from my clients about me, so I've got a couple of clients where I go every other month instead of every month. That's been quite interesting to see how accepting people have been of that. And it has made, that's made my life a bit easier, to be honest.
I think, there's a lot of swings and roundabouts on that stuff, and we're still, we talk about being post-pandemic, but the impacts of it are still huge, and then we're still settling down. We've got a new ways of working kind of group at work who are looking at this, and I think it will take us quite a long time before we find a new equilibrium. So we don't want to go back to how we were before, but I don't think we've yet found the sweet spot of what works as a sustainable system going forward. Maybe you have in your business because it's much smaller, so it's much easier. But I think lots of businesses are still working through that. I think the period kind of post-pandemic, although I'm really reluctant to call it that soon, but that period where everyone went, it's all over now, right, we'll get back to normal, that became another really difficult period because there was this expectation of normality, whatever that is, but actually the impacts were still huge. I still had a hugely increased workload because of various pandemic things and adjustments that had been made. Yet I was suddenly expected to just slip back into, everything's okay now. And even now, I've got probably 25% of my staff off sick in any given week. And that's hugely more than there would have been pre the pandemic. And some of them have got COVID, some of them have got other things, some of them have got operations that are in the backlog because of COVID. So now is a much more difficult time to work than pre-pandemic was. So there's a very, very long impact effect.
It's a little bit depressing that some of the social norming, the power of that is so great that people want to get back to doing stuff the way they used to do it, even if it was a bit crap. Which I don't, I'm looking at it. It doesn't make any logical sense. But I think people cleave to that. Well, this is the way it used to be, because they want that normality, not because it's actually a good way of doing anything.
Yeah.
So people slavishly want to go and work somewhere physically because it makes them feel like it's normal and okay. But equally, one of the organisations I'm involved in, it's been interesting to see the split between people who want to go back to being in an office and people who don't. Because if you've got a big house and a nice working at home setup, then you don't want to go to the office as much. If you live in a tiny property where actually working from home is challenging, that's very difficult. And I think, it's one of the interesting things about the whole thing is that everyone's reality is completely different, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, and what people might want is completely different. What I find concerning, I guess, is those social norming forces are often driven by people's commercial interests, and people just not being honest about it. And they should be upfront and just saying, well, I want this because, not because, it's kind of dressed up as, it would be better for all of us, but it wouldn't necessarily.
I don't know. It's quite difficult though, because some of it is around mental health as well, and You have a job where you see people quite regularly.
That's true.
And you can choose to see them physically or online, whereas I very rarely see my colleagues, and I really miss that opportunity to see people. It's both about socialising with them, but also it's about the overhead of work as well. I have to do all my own thinking around problems quite often, whereas when I saw colleagues regularly, we would chat through things. So I think it's weirdly had an increase in workload or increase in cognitive requirements because of not seeing people. So I think it's quite mixed, and that mental health thing is quite difficult. Yeah, I mean, mental health wise, I've found it difficult during the pandemic. I had some time off work because the combination of the pandemic and a huge change program at work just eventually became overwhelming, and I was knackered as well. I think, there was a cumulative fatigue that came across us, and it all became too much.